They say family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that the people closest to you would never hurt you. I believed that once. My name is Diane Parker, and I'm 73 years old. For most of my life, I thought I understood what family meant. I thought I knew the difference between love and manipulation, between concern and control. I was wrong about so many things, but I wasn't wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 18 months, starting just 3 weeks after my husband Robert's funeral. 18 months that nearly cost me everything I had worked for, everything Robert and I had built together in 47 years of marriage. 18 months where I learned that the most dangerous predators don't break into your home at night. They don't wear masks or carry weapons. Sometimes they sit at your dinner table. Sometimes they call you mom. This story isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what's happening to thousands of elderly people across this country every single day. It's about trust betrayed, love weaponized, and the thin line between protection and imprisonment. It's about how easy it is to make someone disappear without ever laying a hand on them. And it's about what happens when someone underestimates a woman who has survived 7 decades of life's storms. The first red flag should have been the timing. 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, when the casseroles had stopped coming and the sympathy cards had been filed away, when the house felt impossibly large and quiet, that's when Mark showed up with his clipboard and his concerned expression. I was in my garden that Tuesday morning, deadheading the roses that Robert had planted for our 20th anniversary. The October air was crisp, and I was wearing his old cardigan, the blue one with the patches at the elbows that still smelled faintly of his aftershave. I was talking to him, the way I'd started doing since he'd been gone, telling him about Mrs. Henderson's new grandson, about the leak in the upstairs bathroom that the plumber had finally fixed, about how the grocery store had moved the bread aisle again and I couldn't find anything anymore. That's when I heard the car door slam. Mark's BMW, the silver one that always looked like it had just been detailed. He walked across my lawn with that purposeful stride of his, the one that reminded me of a door-to-door salesman, all confidence, and barely concealed agenda. "Diane," he called out, and I noticed he didn't call me Mom anymore, the way he had when Robert was alive. "How are you holding up?" I straightened slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back that had been my companion for the past decade. "I'm managing just fine, Mark. Sarah's at work?" "She is. Actually, that's why I wanted to stop by." He glanced around the garden, and I saw him taking inventory. The slightly overgrown hedges, the wheelbarrow I'd left in the middle of the path, the pile of weeds I hadn't gotten around to composting yet. "I wanted to talk to you about a few things. Some concerns Sarah and I have been discussing." The word concerns landed heavy between us. In my experience, when someone starts a conversation with their concerns about you, it's rarely about your well-being. It's about their discomfort with your choices. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, pulling off my gardening gloves. They were Robert's too, far too big for my hands, but I couldn't bring myself to buy new ones. Mark pulled out his phone, and I saw him scrolling through what looked like notes. "Well, for starters, Mrs. Henderson called Sarah yesterday. She said she was worried because she hadn't seen you in a few days, and when she knocked on your door, Sunday evening, you didn't answer." I remembered Sunday evening. I'd been upstairs, running a bath, with the radio playing. By the time I'd gotten downstairs, whoever had been at the door was gone. I was in the bath. I didn't hear her knock. "That's exactly what we're worried about," Mark said, and his voice took on that tone I'd noticed him using with Sarah sometimes, patient but firm, like he was explaining something to a child. "What if it had been an emergency? What if you'd fallen in the tub or had a medical episode? No one would have known for hours, maybe days." The image he painted settled in my stomach like a cold stone. It was a fear I'd wrestled with myself in the long, quiet hours after Robert's death. The practical reality of living alone at 73, of being the only person who would notice if I didn't wake up one morning. "I have my medical alert bracelet," I said, touching the device on my wrist, "and I talk to Sarah every day." "But what if you couldn't reach the bracelet? What if you were unconscious?" Mark stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and sharp that made my nose itch. "Diane, I know this is hard to hear, but Sarah and I have been noticing some changes." "Changes?" Mark looked uncomfortable, like he was delivering news he didn't want to share. "Last month, when you came to dinner, you forgot Emma's recital. Was that night. You'd promised to be there, and Sarah had to call you 3 times before you remembered. Emma was my granddaughter, Sarah's 8-year-old. I had missed her recital, and the guilt had gnawed at me for weeks. But it wasn't because I was losing my memory. It was because I'd been dealing with the insurance company that day, spending 4 hours on the phone trying to understand Robert's life insurance policy, navigating automated menus, and being transferred from department to department until I was so exhausted I could barely think straight. "I was having a difficult day," I explained. "The insurance. And last week, when you were at the grocery store, you left your purse in the cart and walked out without it. Mr. Davidson from the store had to chase you down in the parking lot." That was true too, and embarrassing to remember. But again, there was context Mark was leaving out. I'd been at the store for over an hour, trying to find items that had been moved during their latest renovation. My back had been aching, and I'd been thinking about Robert, about how he used to push the cart and reach the items on the high shelves. By the time I'd gotten to the checkout, I'd been overwhelmed and distracted. "These things happen," I said, but even as I spoke, I could hear how weak it sounded. Mark's expression softened, and he reached out to touch my arm. "Diane, no one is saying you're losing your mind. But these little incidents, they add up. And Sarah is beside herself with worry. She's afraid something is going to happen to you, and she won't be able to live with herself if she didn't do something to help." The mention of Sarah's worry hit its mark. My daughter had been my anchor through Robert's illness and death, calling me twice a day, bringing groceries, helping with the funeral arrangements. The last thing I wanted was to be a source of stress for her. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "We think it might be time to consider some additional support," Mark said carefully. "Maybe someone to come in a few hours a day, help with meals, medication reminders, that sort of thing." The idea of a stranger in my house, watching my every move, made my skin crawl. This house had been mine and Robert's sanctuary for 32 years. Every room held memories. Every corner had been shaped by our choices. The thought of having to justify my routines, my habits, my decisions to someone else felt like a violation. "I don't need a babysitter," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. Mark held up his hands in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt patronizing. "Not a babysitter. A companion. Someone to help you stay independent safely. There are wonderful services that specialize in this kind of support. I've been managing fine on my own." "Have you?" Mark asked gently. "Diane, when was the last time you had a good night's sleep? When was the last time you ate a proper meal? Sarah tells me you've lost weight." I had lost weight. Food tasted like cardboard without Robert there to share it with. I'd been living on soup and sandwiches, eating because I knew I had to, not because I had any appetite. And sleep had become elusive, the nights stretching endlessly while I lay in our bed, reaching automatically for the warmth that was no longer there. "Grief affects everyone differently," I said, but I could hear the defensiveness in my voice. "Of course it does. And that's why we want to help. Sarah loves you so much, Diane. We both do. We just want to make sure you're safe and taken care of." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mark painting increasingly dire scenarios of what could happen if I continued living alone. He talked about break-ins targeting elderly women, about medical emergencies, about the stress Sarah was under trying to manage her own family while worrying constantly about me. By the time he left, I felt smaller somehow, like his concerns had chipped away at my confidence in my own capabilities. I went inside and looked at myself in the hallway mirror. Really looked. I saw the weight I'd lost, the circles under my eyes, the way my clothes hung loosely on my frame. I saw a woman who looked older than her 73 years, more fragile than I felt inside. That evening, Sarah called as she did every night. "Mom, Mark said he stopped by today," she said. And I could hear the careful neutrality in her voice. "He did. He mentioned some concerns you two have been discussing." There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, I'm scared. I'm scared something is going to happen to you and I won't be there. When Dad was alive, I knew someone was looking out for you. Now." "Sarah, honey, I'm not helpless. I've been taking care of myself for 73 years. "But you haven't been taking care of yourself," she said, and now she was crying. "You've lost so much weight and you sound so tired all the time. Yesterday, when I called, you couldn't remember if you'd taken your blood pressure medication." I had been confused about the medication, mainly because my routine had been disrupted by a doctor's appointment that ran late. But hearing Sarah's distress, I began to doubt my own recollection. "Maybe Mark is right," Sarah continued. "Maybe we should look into getting someone to help out, just a few hours a day. Someone to make sure you're eating properly, taking your medications on schedule." The conversation went on for an hour, with Sarah alternating between tears and practical suggestions. She'd already researched home care services, had compiled a list of references, had spoken to her friend Linda, whose mother had used a wonderful companion service after her husband died. "I don't want to lose you too, Mom," Sarah whispered before we hung up. "I can't lose you too." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, noting things I'd never paid attention to before. The loose board on the front porch that caught my toe sometimes, the bathroom rug that had started to curl at the edges, the step stool I had to use to reach the dishes in the upper cabinets. When had these things become hazards instead of minor inconveniences? I found myself in Robert's study, sitting in his leather chair, surrounded by his books and papers that I hadn't had the heart to sort through yet. On his desk was a photo from our last anniversary, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember now. We looked happy, secure, like people who had figured out how to navigate life together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Robert was gone, and I was alone, and maybe Mark and Sarah were right. Maybe I was fooling myself about how well I was managing. Maybe the woman who had raised 3 children, who had managed the household finances for decades, who had nursed her husband through 2 years of cancer, maybe that woman had died with Robert, leaving behind someone less capable, less sure. The next morning, Sarah arrived with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, the kind of gesture that was meant to soften difficult conversations. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night," I said before she could launch into her rehearsed speech. Relief flooded her face. "And? Maybe we could try it on a trial basis. Someone to come in a few hours a day, help with meals and errands. Just to see how it goes." Sarah hugged me tightly, and I felt her tension drain away. "Oh, Mom, I think this is the right decision. I really do. Mark found a wonderful agency, and they have someone available who comes highly recommended." The pie. Speed with which this solution had materialized should have been another red flag. But I was tired, worn down by grief and self-doubt and the weight of Sarah's worry. I wanted to be the mother who eased her daughter's fears, not the one who added to them. When would this person start? I asked. How about next week? That gives us time to meet with her, go over your routines, make sure it's a good fit. The woman's name was Patricia, and she arrived the following Monday with a bright smile and a clipboard full of forms. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of the nurses who had cared for Robert during his final weeks. Mrs. Parker, she said, settling into my living room with her paperwork spread across the coffee table. I want you to know that my job is to support your independence, not replace it. I'm here to help you do the things you want to do safely and comfortably. She asked about my daily routines, my medical conditions, my preferences. For meals and activities, she made notes about everything, from what time I usually woke up to which television programs I like to watch in the evening. I'll be here from 9 to 3, Monday through Friday, Patricia explained. I can help with meal preparation, light, housekeeping, medication reminders, errands, whatever you need. It sounded reasonable, even helpful. Patricia seemed competent and kind, and Sarah was visibly relieved when she stopped by that evening to see how the first day had gone. She's perfect, Mom, Sarah said. I feel so much better knowing someone is checking on you regularly. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes in how I was being treated. Patricia's helpful suggestions became more insistent. When I wanted to walk to the corner market, she insisted on driving me, citing concerns about my balance on the uneven sidewalk. When I wanted to reorganize my bedroom closet, she suggested I wait until she could help, worried that I might overexert myself. Mark's visits became more frequent, too. He would stop by in the evenings after Patricia had left, ostensibly to see how I was doing. But I noticed he always seemed to have suggestions about things Patricia had mentioned, problems she'd observed, areas where I might need additional support. Patricia mentioned you seemed confused about your medications yesterday, he said one evening, settling into Robert's chair without invitation. I wasn't confused. I was deciding whether to take the extra blood pressure pill Dr. Morrison prescribed. It's been making me dizzy. But you should be taking medication exactly as prescribed, Mark said, pulling out his phone again. Maybe we should set up one of those pill organizers, the kind with different compartments for each day. That way there's no confusion about what to take when. Mark, I've been managing my own medications for decades. But things change. As we get older, Diane, our memory isn't as sharp, our judgment might not be as clear. There's no shame in accepting help. The pill organizer appeared the next week, along with a chart that Patricia had created listing each medication, its dosage, and the time it should be taken. She filled the organizer every Sunday, counting out pills with the precision of a pharmacist. This way, we can both keep track of whether you've taken everything, she explained. If you're ever unsure, we can just check the compartments. What she didn't say, but what I understood, was that the system also allowed her to monitor exactly which medications I had or hadn't taken. My autonomy over my own body was being systematically dismantled, one helpful suggestion at a time. The changes accelerated after that. Mark convinced me to add him as an authorized contact on my bank account, just in case of emergencies. Patricia suggested I stop driving at night, then in bad weather, then on busy roads. Sarah arranged for grocery delivery instead of my weekly shopping trips, citing concerns about my walking long distances through the store. Each restriction was presented as a kindness, a way to keep me safe and reduce my stress. But the cumulative effect was that my world was shrinking, my independence being traded away in small increments for the promise of security. The breaking point came on a Thursday in November. I had been feeling restless all week, trapped in my own home by the walls of concern that had been built around me. I decided to walk to the library, something I'd done countless times over the years. It was only 6 blocks, the weather was mild, and I needed to return some books that were overdue. I waited until Patricia left for her lunch break, then slipped out the back door. The walk felt glorious, the first time in weeks that I'd been outside alone, able to set my own pace and choose my own path. I spent an hour at the library, browsing the new releases, chatting with Mrs. Chen at the reference desk about the book club I'd been attending for 15 years. When I returned home, Patricia was waiting in the living room with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a thin line. Sarah was there too, her face pale with worry. "Mom, where were you?" Sarah rushed to me as if I'd been missing for days instead of 2 hours. "Patricia came back from lunch and you were gone. We've been calling your cell phone." I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter, not thinking I'd need it for such a short trip. "I went to the library. I needed to return some books." "You went alone?" Patricia's voice was sharp with disapproval. "Mrs. Parker, we've discussed this. If you need to go somewhere, I'm here to drive you. What if something had happened? What if you'd fallen or gotten confused or—" "I walked to the library," I interrupted. "The same library I've been going to for 30 years. I'm not an invalid." "Mom, you scared us to death," Sarah said, and she was crying again. "When Patricia couldn't find you, when you weren't answering your phone, we thought—" I looked at their faces, at the genuine fear and distress I'd caused by taking a simple walk, and I felt something crack inside me. Not my resolve, not yet, but something softer. My certainty about my own capabilities, my right to make decisions about my own life. That evening, Mark came by for what he called a family meeting. He sat across from me at my dining room table, the one where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped our children with homework, where we'd planned our retirement dreams. "Diane, we need to talk about what happened today," he said, and his tone was different now, more authoritative. "This incident with the library, it's exactly the kind of thing we've been worried about." "It wasn't an incident. I took a walk." "You left without telling anyone where you were going. You didn't take your phone. Patricia had no idea if you were safe or if something had happened to you." Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. "What if you'd had a medical emergency? What if you'd gotten lost or confused? Sarah would never forgive herself if something happened to you on her watch." "I'm not on Sarah's watch. I'm a grown woman making my own decisions." "Are you?" Mark asked quietly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making increasingly poor decisions that put yourself and everyone who loves you at risk." The accusation hung in the air between us. Poor decisions. As if choosing to walk to the library was evidence of diminished capacity rather than a normal activity for a healthy adult. "I think we need to consider some additional changes," Marky continued. "Maybe Patricia should be here more hours. Maybe we should look into a medical alert system that tracks your location. Maybe I should just move into a nursing home and be done with it," I said bitterly. Mark's face softened and he reached across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "No one wants that, Diane. But we do want you to be realistic about your limitations. Aging isn't easy, and it's okay to need more help than you used to." After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had spent so many peaceful evenings. The roses were dormant now, their summer glory reduced to thorny stems and fallen leaves. I wondered if this was what my own life was becoming, a gradual dying back to something barely recognizable. The next day, Sarah came by with brochures for senior living communities. Not nursing homes, she was quick to clarify, but active adult communities where I could have my own apartment with access to meals, activities, and medical care. "I'm not ready for that," I said, but even as I spoke, I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Mom, maybe it's time to think about it. You'd have your independence, but also security. And Mark and I wouldn't have to worry so much." Mark and I. When? Had my daughter's concerns become so intertwined with her husband's that she couldn't separate them? When had his voice become the one she listened to most carefully? That night, I called my sister Helen, who lived 3 states away. We'd always been close, but we didn't talk as often as we should, both of us busy with our own lives and families. "Helen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," I said after we'd caught up on family news. "Do I sound different to you? Confused or forgetful or diminished somehow?" There was a pause, and I held my breath, afraid of what she might say. "Diane, you sound like someone who's grieving," Helen said finally. "You sound tired and sad and maybe a little lost, which is exactly how someone should sound 6 months after losing their husband of 47 years. But you don't sound confused or incompetent. Why are you asking?" I told her about Mark's concerns, about Patricia, about the gradual erosion of my independence. I told her about the library incident and the brochures for senior living. "Honey," Helen said when I finished, and her voice was gentle but firm, "I think you need to trust your instincts here. You know yourself better than anyone, and if something feels wrong, it probably is. But what if they're right? What if I am declining and I just can't see it? Then where's the medical evidence? Have you been diagnosed with dementia? Are you having medical episodes? Or are you just making normal human mistakes that are being magnified because someone is watching your every move?" Helen's words stayed with me over the following days. I began to pay attention to the subtle ways my autonomy was being undermined, how every small mistake or moment of forgetfulness was cataloged and reported back to Sarah and Mark, how Patricia's helpful observations had become a daily accounting of my supposed deficits. I also began to notice things about Mark that I'd previously overlooked, how he always seemed to steer conversations toward my finances, asking about my retirement accounts, my life insurance, the value of my home, how he'd volunteer to help me organize my important papers, suggesting I might want to update my will while I was at it, how he'd mentioned that Sarah would inherit everything eventually, and wouldn't it be simpler to start transferring assets now, to avoid estate taxes and legal complications later? The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Mark wasn't just concerned about my well-being. He was positioning himself to benefit from my perceived decline. But I wasn't ready to act on that suspicion. Yet, I needed to be sure, and I needed to be smart about it. Because if I was right about Mark's motives, confronting him directly would only accelerate whatever timeline he was working toward. Instead, I began to pay closer attention. I started keeping notes about conversations, about suggestions made and restrictions imposed. I listened more carefully to the words people used when they talked about my future, about what was best for me, about what needed to be done. And slowly, carefully, I began to plan. The woman they thought was becoming helpless was actually becoming something else entirely, something they hadn't counted on, something they were going to regret underestimating. But that revelation was still months away. For now, I had to play the role they'd cast me in while I figured out exactly what game we were all playing and how I was going to win it. The move happened faster than I expected. One day, I was living in my own home, making my own decisions. And the next, I was packing boxes under Patricia's watchful supervision while Mark directed the movers with military precision. "Just the essentials for now," Mark kept saying as I sorted through 47 years of married life. "We can always come back for more once you're settled." But I knew better. I'd seen this pattern before with Robert's Aunt Margaret, how temporary arrangements became permanent, how belongings left behind were eventually donated or discarded because it was easier than making multiple trips. The house that had been my sanctuary was being reduced to a few suitcases and a handful of photographs. Sarah had presented the arrangement as the perfect solution to everyone's concerns. "You'll have your own space in our guest suite," she'd, explained, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm. "Your own bathroom, your own sitting area. But Mark and I will be right there if you need anything, and Emma will love having Grandma so close." The guest suite was lovely, I had to admit. Mark had clearly put effort into making it welcoming, with fresh flowers on the dresser and my favorite books arranged on new shelves. He'd even hung some of my artwork on the walls, family photos strategically, placed to make the space feel familiar, "What do you think?" Sarah asked anxiously as I surveyed my new quarters. "Will you be comfortable here?" I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the grateful mother-in-law, but inside I felt like I was visiting someone else's life. Nothing smelled right. The light fell differently through unfamiliar windows. The sounds were all wrong, the hum of appliances I didn't recognize, voices carrying through walls that weren't mine. "There's just one small thing," Mark said as we finished the tour. "The outside doors have new security codes. For everyone's safety, you understand. I'll write them down for you. But if you need to go anywhere, it's probably easier to just let us know so we can drive you." Security codes. As if I were a flight risk rather than a family member. That first night, I lay in the narrow guest bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Mark and Sarah's household. Their voices drifting down the hallway, the television in the living room, Emma's footsteps running overhead. I was surrounded by family, but I'd never felt more alone. The routine that emerged over the following weeks was subtle but unmistakable. Breakfast was served at 8 sharp, whether I was hungry or not. Patricia still came daily, but now her role had expanded to include monitoring my activities within the house, reporting back to Mark and Sarah about how I'd spent my time, what I'd eaten, how I'd slept. "Your mother seemed agitated yesterday," I overheard her telling Sarah one afternoon. "She kept asking about going back to her house to check on things. I think the transition is harder than she's letting on." Agitated, as if wanting to visit. My own home was a symptom of mental disturbance rather than a natural desire. Mark had taken over the management of my medications with a thoroughness that was both impressive and invasive. He'd consulted with my doctors, researched potential interactions, created color-coded charts that tracked dosages and timing. My pills were now distributed from a locked cabinet in their kitchen, dispensed according to a schedule he'd devised. "It's for your safety," he explained when I questioned the system. "Some of these medications can be dangerous if taken incorrectly, and we want to make sure you're getting exactly what you need when you need it." What I needed, apparently, was to surrender all control over my own body. The blood pressure medication that made me dizzy was no longer optional. The sleep aid I'd used sparingly was now part of my nightly routine. When I complained about feeling groggy in the mornings, Mark suggested it was probably just adjustment to the new environment, nothing to worry about. My car remained parked in my old driveway, slowly accumulating leaves and bird droppings. When I asked about retrieving it, Mark exchanged a look with Sarah that spoke volumes. "Mom, we talked about this," Sarah said gently. "Your reflexes aren't what they used to be, and some of the medications you're taking can affect your coordination. It's really safer for everyone if we handle the driving." "I've been driving for 55 years without an accident." "But—" "You're 73 now," Mark interjected. "And statistics show that elderly drivers are at much higher risk for accidents. We're not trying to punish you, Diane. We're trying to protect you and other people on the road." Statistics. As if I were a data point rather than a person with decades of safe driving experience. The isolation began gradually. My weekly bridge club, which I'd attended for 15 years, became problematic because the meetings were in the evening and Mark was concerned about me being out after dark. My book club, which met on Wednesday afternoons, conflicted with a new physical therapy schedule that Mark had arranged without consulting me. "Physical therapy will help maintain your strength and balance," he explained when I protested. "These other activities, they're nice, but they're not essential for your health and well-being." Essential. Another word that had taken on new meaning in my vocabulary. Everything I enjoyed was deemed non-essential, while everything that kept me under observation was crucial for my survival. The physical therapist, a earnest young woman named Kelly, came to the house twice a week to guide me through exercises. That seemed designed more to document my limitations than improve my capabilities. She tested my balance, my flexibility, my coordination, carefully noting every wobble, every hesitation. Mrs. Parker is showing some concerning signs of instability. I heard her tell Mark after one session. Her gait has become more cautious, and she's having difficulty with the single-leg stands. I'd recommend increasing our sessions to 3 times a week. What Kelly didn't know was that my caution wasn't due to physical decline, but to the constant scrutiny I was under. Every stumble, every moment of unsteadiness was documented and discussed. I'd become hyper-aware of my own movements, second-guessing every step, because I knew it was being evaluated. The financial discussions began about 6 weeks after I'd moved in. Mark approached the topic with the same careful concern he'd used for everything else, presenting it as yet another way to reduce my stress and ensure my security. "Diane, I've been thinking about your financial situation," he said one evening as we sat in their living room, Sarah knitting in her chair while Emma did homework at the dining table. "Managing all those accounts and investments must be overwhelming, especially while you're adjusting to everything else." "I've been managing our finances for decades," I replied. "Robert handled the big picture, but I paid the bills, balanced the checkbooks, kept track of everything." "But that was when Robert was here to help," Mark said smoothly. "And you weren't dealing with the effects of grief and medication and all the changes in your routine. It would be easy to miss something important, to make a mistake that could have serious consequences." He'd done his homework. I had to give him that. He knew about the late payment I'd made on the property taxes, how I'd accidentally paid the electric bill twice in 1 month and then forgotten to pay it the next. Small errors that I'd caught and corrected, but errors nonetheless. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Just that maybe it's time to simplify things, consolidate your accounts, streamline your investments, make everything more manageable." Mark pulled out a folder from the end table, and I realized this conversation had been planned, rehearsed even. "I've been doing some research, and there are ways to restructure your finances that would reduce your tax burden, eliminate a lot of the paperwork, and ensure that everything is properly managed." The documents he showed me were impressive and incomprehensible. Trusts and transfers, beneficiary designations, and power of attorney forms. Legal language that twisted and turned like a maze designed to confuse rather than clarify. "This is a lot to absorb," I said, pushing the papers away. "Of course it is. That's why I think we should schedule a meeting with an attorney, someone who can explain everything properly and make sure your interests are protected." "I have an attorney. Robert and I worked with James Morrison for 20 years. Mark's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Jim Morrison is a nice man, but his practice focuses mainly on real estate and simple wills. For something this complex, you need someone who specializes in estate planning and elder law. I know just the person." The attorney Mark had chosen was named Richard Blackwood, and his office was decorated like a gentleman's club, all dark wood and leather furniture. He had the kind of voice that commanded attention, deep and authoritative, and he spoke to me the way doctors sometimes did, explaining complex concepts in simplified terms that assumed limited understanding. "Mrs. Parker, what Mark is proposing makes excellent financial sense," he said after reviewing the documents. "By transferring certain assets into a trust structure, we can protect your wealth from potential medical expenses, reduce your tax liability, and ensure that your estate passes to your beneficiaries with minimal complications." "What kind of medical expenses?" I asked. Blackwood exchanged a glance with Mark before answering. "Well, as we age, there's always the possibility of extended care needs. Nursing home costs, long-term medical care, that sort of thing. These expenses can quickly deplete even substantial estates. The trust structure we're proposing would shield your assets from those potential claims. But I'm not planning on needing long-term care." "Of course not," Blackwood said with a patronizing smile. "None of us plan on it. But statistics show that most people over 70 will require some form of extended care at some point. It's simply prudent to plan for that possibility. There were those statistics again, being used to justify decisions I hadn't made and didn't want. The meeting lasted 2 hours, with Blackwood explaining the benefits of various financial instruments while Mark nodded approvingly and took notes. By the end, my head was spinning with talk of irrevocable trusts and asset protection, strategies, beneficiary designations, and healthcare directives. "I need time to think about this," I said as we prepared to leave. "Absolutely," Blackwood replied. "But I wouldn't wait too long. The sooner we implement these strategies, the more effective they'll be. And given some of the concerns Mark has shared about your current situation, it's important to get these documents in place while you're still able to make informed decisions." While I'm still able to make informed decisions. The implication was clear. My window of competence was closing, and I needed to act quickly before I lost the capacity to manage my own affairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the attorney's words, about Mark's careful explanations, about the documents that would transfer control of my life's work to people who claimed to have my best interests at heart. I got up and walked quietly through the house, feeling like an intruder in spaces that weren't mine. The kitchen was spotless, everything in its designated place, nothing like the comfortable chaos of my own home where I knew where everything belonged. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the breakfast nook, looking out at their perfectly manicured backyard. That's when I saw Mark's laptop open on the counter, its screen still glowing. He must have forgotten to close it after his evening email session. I glanced around, confirming I was alone, then moved closer to see what was displayed. It was a web page about elder law, specifically about guardianship proceedings. The browser history showed dozens of searches about incompetency determinations, medical evaluations for cognitive decline, legal procedures for taking control of an elderly person's finances. My blood ran cold as I read through the information Mark had been researching: how to document an elderly person's inability to make sound decisions, what kind of medical evidence was needed to establish mental incompetence, how family members could petition for guardianship when someone was no longer capable of managing their own affairs. I quickly scrolled through more of the history and found searches for my financial information: my bank account balances, investment portfolios, property values. He'd been researching my net worth with the thoroughness of someone planning a business acquisition. But the most chilling discovery was a document folder labeled Diane Medical Documentation. Inside were photographs of me looking confused or tired, notes about incidents where I'd seemed forgetful or disoriented, a timeline of what Mark characterized as my declining mental state. The library incident was there, described as subject left home without notification, became lost and disoriented, required assistance finding way back. The confusion about my medication was noted as repeatedly unable to remember which pills to take, dosage confusion, poses safety risk. Even my grief over Robert had been pathologized. Persistent depression and inability to cope with daily tasks following spouse's death indicates significant cognitive and emotional decline. I was looking at a carefully constructed case for my own incompetence, built from months of observation and documentation. Every mistake I'd made, every moment of sadness or confusion, had been cataloged as evidence of my declining mental state. But there was more. In another folder labeled Financial Strategy, I found spreadsheets calculating my total assets, projections of how much money could be accessed through various legal mechanisms, timelines for transferring ownership of my house and investments. Mark hadn't been researching estate planning for my benefit. He'd been researching how to gain control of my money. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly closed the laptop, rushing back to my room with my heart pounding. I lay in bed pretending to sleep when I heard Mark walk through the kitchen, probably checking to make sure he'd locked up properly for the night. The next morning, I acted normal, playing the role of the grateful house guest while my mind raced, with the implications of what I'd discovered. Every interaction took on new meaning. Sarah's worried glances weren't just concern for my well-being. They were assessments of my competence. Patricia's helpful observations weren't meant to support my independence. They were intelligence gathering for a case against my mental capacity. I was living in a house of people who were systematically building a legal argument to take control of my life. But I couldn't confront them directly. Not yet. I needed more information, more evidence of what they were planning. And I needed to be smart about how I gathered it. Over the following days, I became a student of my own imprisonment. I watched how Patricia documented my activities, noting the exact language she used when reporting to Mark and Sarah. I paid attention to the timing of my medications, how certain pills seemed to make me groggier or more confused than others. I observed the way conversations about my future were structured, how my own preferences were consistently overruled by claims about my safety or best interests. Most importantly, I started keeping my own documentation. I found an old notebook in my belongings and began recording everything. Conversations, incidents, medications, the gradual erosion of my autonomy. I wrote it all down in careful detail, creating my own timeline of what was really happening. The notebook became my secret weapon, hidden in the bottom of my underwear drawer where no one would think to look. Every night, I would add new entries, building a record of the systematic campaign to undermine my independence and gain control of my assets. I also began testing my own mental acuity, challenging myself with puzzles and memory exercises, keeping track of my performance to counter any claims about cognitive decline. I was sharper than I'd been in months, focused by the clarity of understanding what I was really fighting. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, during another evening when Mark left his laptop unattended. This time, I was prepared. I had learned enough about computers from watching Emma do her homework to know how to navigate more carefully through his files. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Mark wasn't just planning to gain control of my finances. He was drowning, in debt. Credit cards maxed out, business loans in default, a second mortgage on their house that was months behind in payments. He needed my money not just for greed, but for survival. The most damning document was an email exchange with Richard Blackwood, the attorney, discussing the timeline for guardianship proceedings. They were planning to have me declared incompetent within the next 2 months, using the medical and behavioral documentation Mark had been collecting as evidence. The subject shows clear signs of declining cognitive function and inability to manage complex financial decisions, Mark had written. Recent incidents demonstrate poor judgment and potential safety risks. Medical documentation supports concerns about progressive dementia. Progressive dementia. Based on what? A few moments of forgetfulness and confusion that could be explained by grief, medication side effects, and the stress of being constantly monitored and controlled. But I also found something else in Mark's files. Evidence of his financial desperation was creating pressure in his marriage. Sarah had been asking questions about their mounting debts, about why he was so interested in my financial arrangements, about whether his concern for my well-being was entirely altruistic. There were text messages between Mark and someone named David, apparently a friend or business partner, discussing the timeline for accessing my assets. "The old lady is proving more stubborn than expected," Mark had written. "May need to accelerate the medical evaluation process." Old lady, as if I were an obstacle to be removed rather than a person with rights and feelings. But the most revealing document was a draft petition for guardianship that Blackwood had prepared, ready to be filed as soon as they had sufficient medical evidence of my incompetence. The petition painted me as a confused, declining elderly woman who posed a danger to herself and others through her poor judgment and inability to manage her affairs. Reading that document, seeing myself described as incompetent and dangerous, was like looking at a distorted mirror that reflected everything I was not. But I realized that in the legal system, perception often mattered more than reality. If Mark could convince a judge that I was mentally compromised, the truth of my Actual capabilities would become irrelevant. I printed copies of the most damaging documents, carefully covering my tracks by deleting the print history and making sure everything looked exactly as I'd found it. The evidence I gathered would be crucial for what I was beginning to plan. My own counterattack. But I had to be patient. I had to let them make their move while I prepared my response. Because the woman they thought they were manipulating was actually gathering ammunition for a battle they didn't know was coming. The medications were the next piece of the puzzle. I began checking the pills Mark dispensed against the original prescriptions, and I discovered that some of them had been altered. The sleep aid that was making me groggy in the mornings was being given at double the prescribed dose. An anxiety medication I'd never been prescribed had been added to my evening pills, something that would explain the foggy thinking and memory problems I'd been experiencing. When I confronted Mark about the discrepancy, he had a ready explanation. "Dr. Harrison adjusted your dosages last week," he said smoothly. "He was concerned about your anxiety levels and thought you needed a little extra help sleeping. I have the updated prescription right here." The prescription he showed me was genuine, but when I called Dr. Harrison's office, I learned something interesting. The doctor had made those changes based on a phone consultation with Mark, who had reported that I was having severe anxiety and insomnia that was affecting my daily functioning. Severe anxiety and insomnia that I hadn't experienced until I'd started taking the medications that were supposed to treat them. It was a perfect closed loop. The medications caused symptoms that justified more medications, which caused more symptoms that provided evidence of my declining mental state. Mark was literally drugging me into incompetence while documenting the results as proof of my need for care. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking the pills Mark dispensed, I began palming them, pretending to swallow while actually hiding them in my cheek until I could dispose of them later. It was a risk. If he caught me, it would provide more evidence of non-compliance and poor judgment. But I needed my mind clear for what was coming. Within a week of stopping the unnecessary medications, the fog began to lift. My thinking became sharper, my memory more reliable, my energy levels improved. I was returning to myself, becoming the woman who had successfully managed a household and finances for decades, who had navigated the complexities of caring for a terminally ill husband who had raised 3 children and helped build a successful family business. But I had to be careful not to let anyone notice the improvement too quickly. I continued to play the role of the slightly confused, increasingly dependent elderly woman, while secretly planning my escape from the trap that had been set for me. The plan I was forming was complex and would require perfect timing. I would need allies, evidence, and most importantly, I would need to catch Mark in the act of his deception in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But first, I had to survive the next phase of his campaign. Because according to the timeline I'd found in his files, the medical evaluation that would determine my competency was scheduled for the following week. The doctor Mark had chosen was a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Reginald Winters, someone who specialized in cognitive assessments for elderly patients. According to his website, he frequently testified in guardianship proceedings about the mental capacity of older adults. "It's just a routine evaluation," Mark explained when he told me about the appointment. "Dr. Winters will ask you some questions, maybe do a few simple tests, just to establish a baseline for your cognitive function. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about except that the outcome of this evaluation would determine whether I retained control over my own life or lost it forever. I had 1 week to prepare for the most important test I'd ever taken. 1 week to gather the evidence I needed to prove that the real threat to my well-being wasn't my supposedly declining mind, but the people who claimed to be protecting me. The countdown had begun, and everything I'd worked for, everything Robert and I had built together, hung in the balance. Dr. Winters arrived at Mark and Sarah's house on a gray Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that medical professionals reserve for difficult cases. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with prematurely silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic appearance. "Mrs. Parker," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt like he was testing my coordination. "I'm Dr. Winters. I understand we're going to spend some time together today, just having a conversation and going through a few simple exercises." Simple exercises. The way he said it reminded me of how people talk to children, all reassurance and hidden condescension. Mark had positioned himself in the corner of the living room like an observer at a research study, his notebook already open, pen poised to record whatever evidence of my incompetence might emerge. Sarah hovered nearby, wringing her hands with what appeared to be genuine anxiety about what the evaluation might reveal. "Let's start with some basic questions," Dr. Winters said, settling into Robert's old armchair with the familiarity of someone who had done this countless times before. "Can you tell me what day it is today?" "Tuesday, November 14th, I replied clearly. "It's a cloudy morning, approximately 9:30, and you've come here to evaluate my mental capacity at the request of my son-in-law." Dr. Winters made a note, and I caught the flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that I understood exactly what was happening. "Good. And can you tell me who the current president is?" I answered correctly, along with the next dozen questions about basic orientation and current events. Dr. Winters moved through his checklist with mechanical efficiency, testing my memory with word lists and number sequences, my attention with arithmetic problems, my reasoning with hypothetical scenarios. "Mrs. Parker, I'm going to give you an address to remember," he said about 30 minutes into the evaluation. "I want you to repeat it back to me now, and I'll ask you to recall it again in a few minutes. The address is 42 Oak Street, Apartment 7B, Chicago, Illinois." I repeated the address perfectly, noting how Mark leaned forward slightly. When Dr. Winters mentioned he'd ask for it again later. This was clearly one of the tests Mark was expecting me to fail. "Now, let's talk about some practical matters," Dr. Winters continued. "How do you typically manage your medications?" This was dangerous territory. I knew Mark had briefed Dr. Winters about my supposed confusion with pills, the incidents he'd documented about missed doses and incorrect timing. "Until recently, I managed them myself," I said carefully. "I've been taking the same blood pressure medication for 5 years, a multivitamin, and occasionally something for headaches. Since moving here, Mark has been helping organize them in a weekly dispenser." "And why did you need help with organization?" I could feel Mark's attention sharpening. This was his moment, the chance for me to demonstrate the confusion that would justify his intervention. "Mark felt it would be safer," I said simply. "He was concerned about potential mistakes." "Have you been making mistakes with your medications?" "I once took my blood pressure pill twice in one day by accident. It happened about a month after my husband died, when I was dealing with insurance paperwork and feeling overwhelmed." Dr. Winters nodded and made more notes. "Tell me about your husband's death. How has that affected your daily life?" For the next 20 minutes, I found myself describing Robert's illness, the 2 years of treatments and hospital stays, the gradual loss of the man I'd loved for nearly 5 decades. Dr. Winters listened with professional sympathy, occasionally asking about my sleep patterns, appetite, social connections. "Grief can certainly affect cognitive function," he said when I finished. "Memory, concentration, decision-making ability. Have you noticed changes in those areas since your husband passed?" This was the trap. Admit to grief-related difficulties, and it would be characterized as cognitive decline. Deny them, and I'd seem either dishonest or lacking in self-awareness. "I've had some difficulties with concentration," I said honestly. "There have been times when I've felt overwhelmed by tasks that used to be routine, but I think that's normal when you're adjusting to life without a partner of 47 years. "Of course. Now, I'd like to ask you about some recent incidents that Mark has shared with me." Dr. Winters consulted his notes. "About 3 weeks ago, You left the house without telling anyone where you were going. Can you tell me about that? I walked to the library to return some books. I've been walking to that library for 30 years. I didn't realize I needed permission. But you didn't take your cell phone, and when Patricia couldn't find you, there was considerable concern about your safety. I forgot my phone. I was only gone for 2 hours, and I was never in any danger. Dr. Winters made more notes, and I could practically hear Mark's mental commentary about my defensive tone, my failure to acknowledge the legitimate concerns my behavior had caused. Let's talk about financial management, Dr. Winters continued. Mark tells me there have been some issues with bill paying, missed deadlines, that sort of thing. I made 2 mistakes in 6 months. I paid the electric bill twice 1 month and was late with property taxes another time. Both errors were corrected without any lasting consequences. But managing finances has become more difficult since you've been on your own. Everything has become more difficult since my husband died. That doesn't mean I'm incapable of learning to manage on my own. The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from my driving habits to my social activities to my plans for the future. Dr. Winters had clearly been briefed thoroughly by Mark, because he knew details about incidents I'd barely remembered, mistakes I'd made that had been recorded and catalogued as evidence of my declining capabilities. Finally, he asked me to recall the address he'd given me earlier. 42 Oak Street, apartment 7B, Chicago, Illinois, I recited without hesitation. Something shifted in Dr. Winters' expression at that moment. The address test was clearly one he expected elderly patients to fail, and my perfect recall seemed to surprise him. "Mrs. Parker, I'm going to ask you to do one more exercise," he said, pulling out a sheet of paper. "I want you to draw a clock face showing the time is 3:15. The clock drawing test. I'd read about this online during my own research into cognitive assessments. It was designed to reveal problems with spatial relationships, executive function, and memory. I drew a careful circle, placed the numbers correctly, and positioned the hands to show 3:15. Dr. Winters studied my drawing for a long moment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker. That concludes our formal assessment. I'd like to speak with Mark and Sarah privately now, if you don't mind." I was dismissed to my room like a child sent away while the adults discussed important matters. But I'd anticipated this moment and had prepared accordingly. The guest room shared a heating vent with the living room, and if I positioned myself correctly near the floor register, I could hear conversations downstairs with remarkable clarity. "Well, doctor, what's your assessment?" Mark's voice carried easily through the ductwork. "It's interesting," Dr. Winters replied, and he sounded puzzled. Mrs. Parker's performance on the cognitive tests was actually quite good. Her memory is intact, her reasoning appears sound, and she demonstrated good insight into her situation. There was a pause, and I could imagine Mark's expression of confusion and frustration. But what about the incidents we discussed? Sarah's voice now, higher pitched with anxiety. The confusion with medications, getting lost, the poor judgment about safety? Those are certainly concerning behaviors, Dr. Winters acknowledged, but they could be explained by grief reaction, adjustment, difficulties, or medication side effects, rather than cognitive impairment. I'd need to see more objective evidence of functional decline to support a finding of incompetence. More evidence? Mark's voice had an edge to it now. "Doctor, I've been documenting problems for months. The woman can't remember to take her pills correctly. She wanders off without telling anyone. She's making financial mistakes that could have serious consequences. I understand your concerns, and they're certainly valid, but the legal standard for incompetence is quite high. The person must be unable to make reasonable decisions about their personal care or finances, and that inability must be due to a mental disorder or cognitive deficiency." "So what are you saying?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying that based on today's evaluation, I cannot recommend a finding of incompetence. Mrs. Parker appears to have the mental capacity to make decisions about her own life, even if those decisions sometimes seem unwise to family members. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. I could practically feel Mark's rage radiating through the floor. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up evaluation in a few months, Dr. Winters continued diplomatically. Sometimes these conditions progress, and what isn't apparent today might become clearer with time. A few months? Mark's voice was tight with controlled frustration. Doctor, we can't wait a few months. Diane is living in our home, and we're responsible for her safety and well-being. If something happens to her because we failed to get proper legal protection in place, I understand the difficulty of your situation, but I can only report what I observe, and what I observed today was an elderly woman who, while clearly grieving and adjusting to major life changes, retains the cognitive capacity to make her own decisions. After Dr. Winters left, I heard Mark and Sarah arguing in hushed but intense tones. Sarah seemed relieved by the doctor's assessment, but Mark was clearly furious that his timeline had been disrupted. "This just delays the inevitable," he said. "She's declining, Sarah. You've seen it yourself. Maybe she managed to pull herself together for one evaluation, but that doesn't change the day-to-day reality of what we're dealing with." "Maybe we're wrong about this," Sarah replied quietly. "Maybe Mom is doing better than we thought. Maybe the problems we've been seeing are just adjustment issues like the doctor said." "Sarah, your mother left $20,000 in a checking account that earns no interest while she's got investment opportunities sitting right there. She's been paying for services she doesn't need, making decisions that don't make financial sense. That's not adjustment issues. That's cognitive decline." I almost laughed at the irony. The $20,000 Mark was criticizing me for? Leaving in checking was money I'd deliberately kept liquid because I'd been planning to make some major purchases for the house. The services I was paying for were things like lawn care and house cleaning that I'd continued because they employed people I'd known for years and didn't want to leave without work. But Mark was reframing every reasonable decision I made as evidence of incompetence, every choice he disagreed with as proof of my declining mental state. The conversation continued for another hour, with Mark outlining his plans for a second evaluation with a different doctor, someone who might be more willing to see the problems he was documenting. Sarah's objections grew weaker as Mark painted increasingly dire pictures of what might happen if they didn't take legal action soon. That evening, Patricia arrived for what she announced was going to be an expanded schedule of supervision. Instead of leaving at 3 o'clock, she would now stay until after dinner, helping with evening medications and ensuring I was settled safely for the night. "It's just while we're adjusting your care plan," Mark explained when I questioned the change. "Dr. Winters suggested we might need additional support during the transition period." Dr. Winters had suggested no such thing, but I didn't contradict Mark. I was beginning to understand that truth was malleable in his world, shaped to support whatever narrative he needed to advance his agenda. The expanded supervision meant I had fewer opportunities to gather intelligence about Mark's plans, but it also gave me more time to observe Patricia's methods. I began to notice how she steered conversations, how she asked leading questions that were designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as confusion or poor judgment. "Are you feeling anxious about anything today, Mrs. Parker?" she might ask. And if I mentioned any concern at all, it would be noted as evidence of excessive worry or emotional instability. "Did you remember to wash your face this morning?" was another favorite, asked in a tone that implied forgetfulness was expected and concerning. I also noticed how Patricia reported these interactions to Mark, always emphasizing the negative aspects while minimizing anything that demonstrated my competence. "She seemed agitated when I asked about her medications," Patricia would say, when in fact I'd simply asked a legitimate question about why my dosage had been changed. "She had trouble remembering what she'd had for lunch," she would report, when the truth was that I'd eaten a sandwich but couldn't remember what kind of mustard I'd used. Every interaction was being filtered through a lens that transformed normal, human behavior into symptoms of decline. But I was learning to play the game too. I began giving Patricia exactly the kind of responses I knew she was looking for, while secretly documenting her methods in my hidden notebook. If she wanted evidence of confusion, I would provide just enough to satisfy her expectations without actually compromising my position. I'm having trouble remembering what day it is, I might say, when I knew perfectly well it was Thursday. These pills all look the same to me, I would comment about my medications, even though I could identify each one by sight. It was a delicate balance, appearing just confused enough to avoid suspicion while not so impaired that it would support the case for incompetence. I was walking a tightrope between playing the role Mark expected and maintaining the evidence that I was actually quite capable. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own investigation into Mark's background. During the few moments when I could access a computer without supervision, I researched his business history, his financial situation, and his methods for gaining control over elderly people's assets. What I discovered was disturbing. Mark had a pattern of financial relationships with older adults that had ended badly. A former business partner's elderly mother had signed over power of attorney to Mark shortly before being placed in a nursing home, with her assets mysteriously depleted. By the time she died, an elderly neighbor had made Mark the beneficiary of her life insurance policy after he'd helped her through a difficult period following her husband's death. There were other incidents, too, carefully buried in legal documents and public records. A history of businesses that failed just as investors were expecting returns. Loans that had been defaulted on when creditors got too aggressive. A pattern of financial desperation that drove him to target vulnerable people who had assets he could access. Mark wasn't just greedy. He was a predator with a specific methodology for exploiting elderly people's trust and vulnerability. But knowing his pattern wasn't enough. I needed evidence of his current actions that would stand up in court, proof that he was deliberately undermining my mental health and manipulating my medical care for financial gain. The breakthrough came when I discovered Mark's secondary cell phone. I'd noticed him occasionally using a different device than his regular iPhone, usually when he thought no one was paying attention. One evening, he left it charging in the kitchen while he helped Emma with her homework upstairs. The phone wasn't password protected, and I quickly scrolled through his recent messages. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. There were conversations with David, the business partner I'd seen mentioned in his computer files, discussing timelines for accessing my assets and strategies for accelerating the guardianship process. "Old bird is tougher than expected," Mark had texted. "Psych eval didn't go as planned. May need to explore other options." "What kind of other options?" David had replied. "Medication adjustment might help. Doctor says anxiety meds can affect cognitive function. Might need to increase dosage. Be careful. Don't want to create obvious problems. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." There were also messages with someone identified only as RB, who I realized must be Richard Blackwood, the attorney. "Evaluation results not optimal," Mark had written. "Subject performed better than anticipated. May need alternative approach." "Medical emergency might expedite timeline," Blackwood had replied. "Fall, medication reaction, something that demonstrates immediate risk. Working on it, will keep." You posted. Medical emergency. They were actually discussing ways to create a health crisis that would justify emergency guardianship proceedings. I took photos of the most damaging messages with my own phone, my hands shaking slightly, as I realized how close I was to discovering the full scope of their plan. But I also knew I was running out of time. If Mark was planning to create a medical emergency, I needed to act quickly to protect myself. The next morning brought news that accelerated everything. Mark announced that he'd scheduled another psychiatric evaluation, this time with a doctor who specialized in cases where family members were concerned about an elderly person's safety. "Dr. Winters suggested we get a second opinion," Mark said over breakfast, his tone carefully casual. Dr. Rebecca Sharp has extensive experience with situations like ours. She'll be here Friday morning. Dr. Rebecca Sharp. I researched her immediately and discovered that she had a reputation for finding incompetence in cases where other doctors had not. Her evaluations frequently supported family members' requests for guardianship, and she often testified in court about the dangers of allowing cognitively impaired elderly people to maintain control over their own affairs. I had 3 days to prepare for an evaluation that would likely determine my fate. 3 days to gather enough evidence to counter the case that was being built against me. 3 days to figure out how to turn the tables on people who had been planning my downfall for months. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. While they thought they were manipulating a confused, declining elderly woman, they were actually dealing with someone who had been documenting their every move, someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The medication tampering was the most immediate threat. I knew Mark was planning to increase my anxiety medication to create symptoms that would support a finding of incompetence, so I began documenting every pill he gave me, photographing them before pretending to take them, keeping detailed records of what I was supposed to be taking versus what I was actually given. I also started recording conversations whenever possible, using the voice recorder app on my phone to capture Mark's interactions with Patricia, with Sarah, with anyone involved in my care. The recordings revealed a consistent pattern of exaggerating my problems and minimizing my capabilities. But the most important piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, had been quietly observing the adult drama unfolding in her house. Children notice things adults think they're hiding, and Emma had been paying attention. "Grandma," she said one afternoon when we were alone, in the garden, "why does Daddy Mark keep talking to that lawyer man about you?" "What lawyer man, sweetheart?" "The one who comes over sometimes when you're taking your nap. I heard them talking about papers that would make Daddy Mark the boss of your money." Emma's innocent observation confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Mark was having regular meetings with Blackwood that I wasn't aware of, planning legal strategies during times when I was sedated by the medications he was giving me. "Did you hear anything else they said?" I asked gently. "Daddy Mark was worried because the first doctor said you were okay. He said they needed to find a doctor who would say you were sick so they could take care of you better." Out of the mouths of babes. Emma had understood more about what was happening than Sarah, who was still convinced that Mark's actions were motivated by genuine concern for my well-being. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Dr. Sharp's evaluation, instead of hoping I could somehow convince her of my competence while being sabotaged by medication and false documentation, I was going to take control of the situation. I was going to expose Mark's conspiracy before he could complete it. But to do that, I needed help. I needed someone outside the circle of manipulation, someone who could see clearly what was happening and had the authority to do something about it. I knew exactly who that person was, and I knew how to reach him without Mark or Patricia knowing. The plan I was forming was risky and would require perfect timing, but it was my only chance to escape the trap that had been so carefully constructed around me. Friday morning was coming, and with it, Dr. Sharp's evaluation. But by then, if everything went according to plan, the people who thought they were about to take control of my life would discover that the woman they'd been underestimating had been preparing a surprise of her own. Thursday evening, I waited until the house settled into its nighttime rhythm. Mark was in his home office, likely preparing for Dr. Sharp's visit, while Sarah helped Emma with a science project in the dining room. Patricia had left hours earlier, but not before administering what she believed was my evening medication. The pills I'd palmed were safely disposed of, and my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I slipped out through the back door, using the security code I'd memorized by watching Mark's fingers on the keypad. The night air was crisp against my face as I walked the 6 blocks to the all-night diner on Maple Street, a place where I knew I could use the payphone without being traced through cell tower records. The number I dialed belonged to Detective Frank Morrison, James Morrison's son. Frank had grown up knowing my family, had even dated Sarah briefly in high school before they'd drifted apart. More importantly, he worked in the elder fraud division of the county sheriff's office. "Frank, this is Diane Parker," I said when he answered, recognizing his voice despite not having spoken to him in over a year. "Mrs. Parker? It's pretty late. Is everything okay?" "No, it's not. I need your help, and I need you to listen carefully because I may not get another chance to call you." I could hear the shift in his tone, the professional alertness replacing casual concern. "What's going on?" "I'm being systematically defrauded by my son-in-law, Mark Thompson. He's drugging me, manipulating my medical care, and building a case to have me declared incompetent so he can gain control of my assets. I have evidence, but I need someone in law enforcement to witness what's happening before he completes his plan." There was a pause, and I could imagine Frank processing what I'd just told him. Elder fraud was his specialty, but having a family friend reported in the middle of the night probably wasn't typical protocol. "Mrs. Parker, these are serious allegations. Are you safe right now?" "For the moment, but he's scheduled another psychiatric evaluation for tomorrow morning with a doctor who has a reputation for finding incompetence. If she declares me mentally unfit, Mark will have emergency guardianship within days." "Where are you calling from?" "The Maple Street Diner. I snuck out to contact you because all my communications are being monitored." "Stay there. I'm coming." "To get you." "No. That would alert them that I've reached out for help. I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning during the evaluation, but make it look routine. A wellness check, maybe, or following up on something unrelated." Frank was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him thinking through the logistics. "What kind of evidence do you have?" "Photographs of text messages discussing plans to create a medical emergency, documentation of medication tampering, recordings of conversations where Mark discusses gaining control of my finances, financial records showing his debts and research into my assets." "Jesus, Mrs. Parker, how long has this been going on?" "Months, but it's accelerating now because his financial situation is becoming desperate." "Frank, I need you to understand something. I'm not a confused old woman calling in imaginary conspiracies. I'm completely lucid, and I have proof of everything I'm telling you." "I believe you. What time is the evaluation tomorrow?" 10 o'clock. Dr. Rebecca Sharp. If you could arrive around 10:30, you'd catch them in the middle of the process." "I'll be there. Mrs. Parker, be very careful until then. If what you're saying is true, these people are dangerous." I hung up the phone and walked back through the quiet streets to Mark and Sarah's house, slipping in through the back door and resetting the alarm. No one had noticed my absence, and I made it back to my room without detection. But I couldn't sleep. Instead, I spent the night organizing the evidence I'd gathered, arranging photographs and documents in chronological order, preparing a clear narrative that would demonstrate the systematic nature of Mark's fraud. I also wrote a detailed statement explaining everything that had happened, from the first expressions of concern about my living alone to the discovery of Mark's text messages about creating medical emergencies. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of overcast sky that made everything look slightly ominous. I dressed carefully in a conservative blue dress that I knew made me look respectable and competent, then went downstairs for breakfast. Mark was already in the kitchen, looking unusually tense. He'd laid out my morning medications next to a glass of orange juice, and I noticed there were more pills than usual. "Extra vitamin C," he explained when he saw me looking. Dr. Sharp mentioned that some patients perform better on cognitive tests when they're not fighting off minor infections. I doubted Dr. Sharp had mentioned any such thing, but I nodded and palmed the pills as I'd been doing for weeks. The orange juice tasted slightly bitter, and I suspected it had been doctored as well, so I only pretended to drink it. Sarah joined us a few minutes later, her anxiety evident in every gesture. She kept glancing at me as if looking for signs of the mental deterioration that would justify what they were about to do. "How are you feeling this morning, Mom?" she asked, her voice artificially bright. "I'm fine, dear. A little nervous about meeting another doctor, but I suppose that's normal." "Dr. Sharp is supposed to be very thorough," Mark said, not looking up from his newspaper. "She'll probably ask you a lot of questions about your daily routines, your memory, how you've been managing since Dad died." The way he emphasized certain words told me he was coaching me, trying to plant suggestions about how I should respond. But I just nodded and continued eating my breakfast, playing the role of the compliant elderly woman while my mind raced with anticipation of what was coming. Dr. Sharp arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, and I could see immediately why Mark had chosen her. She was a severe-looking woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and an expression that suggested she'd already formed opinions before walking through the door. "Mrs. Parker," she said, her handshake perfunctory and cold. "I'm Dr. Sharp. I understand we need to discuss some concerns about your current living situation." The evaluation began much like the one with Dr. Winters, but Dr. Sharp's approach was markedly different. Where Dr. Winters had been neutral and professional, Dr. Sharp seemed to be looking for problems, her questions phrased in ways that assumed deficits rather than testing for them. "How often do you find yourself confused about what day it is?" she asked, rather than simply asking me to identify the current day. "Do you ever forget whether you've taken your medications?" Instead of asking about my medication routine, "Have you had any incidents where you've gotten lost or disoriented?" Rather than asking about my mobility and independence. Each question was loaded with the presumption that these problems existed, requiring me to either confirm issues I didn't have or sound defensive by denying them. But I'd prepared for this approach. Instead of becoming defensive, I answered each question with specific examples that demonstrated competence while acknowledging the normal challenges of aging and grief. I occasionally have to think for a moment about what day it is, especially since my routine changed after moving here, I said in response to her first question. But I don't believe that's unusual for someone adjusting to major life changes. When she asked about medication confusion, I said, "I did make a mistake with my blood pressure medication once, about 6 weeks after my husband died. I was dealing with insurance paperwork and took it twice by accident. Since then, I've been more careful about keeping track." I could see Mark growing increasingly frustrated as the evaluation continued. My responses were measured and reasonable, demonstrating awareness of my limitations while clearly indicating that I remained mentally competent. Dr. Sharp moved on to cognitive testing, but again, her approach was more aggressive than Dr. Winters had been. She seemed disappointed when I performed well on memory tasks, surprised when I solved problems correctly, almost annoyed when I drew a perfect clock face showing the requested time. "Mrs. Parker," she said after about an hour, "I'd like to ask you about some specific incidents that have been reported to me." This was where Mark's documentation would come into play, the carefully compiled evidence of my supposed decline. "I understand that you recently left the house without informing anyone of your destination, causing considerable concern among your family members." I walked to the library to return books. I've been doing that for 30 years without incident. "But you didn't take your cell phone, and when you couldn't be located, there were fears for your safety." I forgot my phone, which I acknowledge was careless, but I was never in danger, and I returned within 2 hours. Dr. Sharp made extensive notes about my minimization of the concerns my behavior had caused, characterizing my reasonable explanations as evidence of poor insight. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, with Dr. Sharp clearly building toward a predetermined conclusion. I could see it in her body language, in the way she emphasized certain responses while dismissing others. That's when I heard the doorbell ring. Mark looked confused, then annoyed. They weren't expecting anyone, and Dr. Sharp's evaluation was reaching its critical phase. "I'll get it," Sarah called from the kitchen, and I heard her footsteps crossing to the front door. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Detective Morrison with the County Sheriff's Office. We're conducting routine wellness checks on elderly residents in the area following some reports of telephone scams targeting seniors. Is Mrs. Diane Parker available to speak with me?" My heart nearly stopped. Frank had come, just as he'd promised, but I hadn't expected him to be so direct about identifying me. Mark's face went pale, and I saw panic flicker in his eyes before he managed to compose himself. "Of course, officer. Mrs. Parker is my mother-in-law. She's currently meeting with her doctor, but I'm sure she'd be happy to speak with you when they're finished." "Actually, these scams have been quite sophisticated." Frank's voice carried clearly into the living room. "I'd prefer to speak with Mrs. Parker directly, if you don't mind. It'll only take a few minutes." Dr. Sharp looked annoyed at the interruption, but Mark had no choice but to invite Frank into the living room. "Mrs. Parker," Frank said, extending his hand. "I'm Detective Morrison. I apologize for interrupting your appointment, but we've had several reports of scammers targeting elderly residents with elaborate schemes, and I wanted to make sure you haven't been contacted by anyone suspicious." I shook his hand, noting the slight pressure he applied that told me he was ready for whatever I was about to do. "Actually, Detective Morrison, your timing is perfect," I said, rising from my chair. "I've been trying to figure out how to report a crime, and you've just solved that problem for me." The room went dead silent. Mark's mouth opened slightly. Sarah looked confused, and Dr. Sharp's pen stopped moving across her notepad. "What kind of crime, Mrs. Parker?" Frank asked, his voice professionally neutral. "Fraud, elder abuse, medication tampering, conspiracy. To gain control of my assets through false claims of mental incompetence." Mark shot to his feet. "Diane, what are you saying? You're obviously confused." "I'm not confused, Mark. I'm completely lucid, and I have evidence of everything you've been doing." I walked to my purse and pulled out the manila folder I'd prepared the night before, handing it to Frank. "Detective Morrison, this folder contains photographs of text messages where my son-in-law discusses plans to create a medical emergency to expedite guardianship proceedings. It includes documentation of medication tampering, where he's been giving me drugs that weren't prescribed to create symptoms of cognitive decline. It contains financial records showing his desperate situation and his research into my assets." Mark's face had gone from pale to flushed red. "This is ridiculous. Diane has been showing signs of paranoia and delusional thinking. Dr. Sharp, please tell the detective what you've observed during your evaluation." But Dr. Sharp was staring at me with a new expression, one that suggested she was reassessing everything she'd just witnessed. "Detective Morrison," I continued, "I've also been recording conversations where Patricia Collins, the aide they hired, discusses strategies for documenting my supposed incompetence. I have evidence of secret meetings between Mark and attorney Richard Blackwood where they planned legal strategies for gaining control of my finances." Frank was already flipping through the documents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "Furthermore," I said, pulling out my cell phone, "I have recordings of conversations where Mark discusses increasing my medication dosages to affect my cognitive function for this evaluation." I played one of the audio files, Mark's voice clearly audible, discussing with David how anxiety medications could be used to create confusion and memory problems. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah was staring at Mark with growing horror, while Dr. Sharp was rapidly making notes of her own. "Mark," Sarah whispered, "please tell me this isn't true." Mark's composure finally cracked. "Sarah, you know how much your mother has deteriorated. She's clearly having paranoid delusions, creating elaborate conspiracy theories. This is exactly the kind of thing that proves she needs help." "Actually," Dr. Sharp interjected, her voice cutting through Mark's protests, "Mrs. Parker's presentation during this evaluation has been entirely consistent with someone who is mentally competent. Her responses were logical, her memory intact, her reasoning sound. If what she's alleging is true, it would explain some of the inconsistencies I've been noting. Frank looked up from the documents. Mrs. Parker, are you willing to make a formal statement about these allegations? Absolutely. I've been documenting everything for months, waiting for the right moment to expose what's been happening. This is insane, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction now. Diane, think about what you're saying. I've been trying to help you, to keep you safe. We all have. You've been trying to steal from me, I replied calmly. You've systematically isolated me, drugged me, and manipulated my medical care to create a false case for incompetence. You've done this because you're drowning in debt, and you need my money to save yourself. Sarah was crying now, the reality of what her husband had been doing finally breaking through her denial. The $23,000 in credit card debt, I continued, looking directly at Mark. The failed business ventures, the second mortgage on this house that's 3 months behind. You thought I was just a confused old woman who wouldn't notice what you were doing. Mark's face had gone ashen. The specific financial details proved I'd done my homework, that this wasn't the confused rambling of a demented person, but the precise accusations of someone who had been gathering evidence. Frank closed the folder and looked at Mark with the expression he probably reserved for suspects he was about to arrest. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions about these allegations. I want my lawyer, Mark said immediately. That's your right. Mrs. Parker, I'll need you to come to the station as well to make a formal statement. Dr. Sharp cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. Detective Morrison, for what it's worth, my professional opinion is that Mrs. Parker is entirely competent to make decisions about her own life and finances. Her presentation today has been that of an intelligent woman who has been victimized, not someone suffering from cognitive impairment. Those words, coming from the doctor Mark had specifically chosen to find me incompetent, were like a nail in the coffin of his scheme. As Frank led Mark toward the door in handcuffs, my son-in-law turned back to look at me with an expression of pure hatred. You think you're so smart, he hissed. You have no idea what you've just done to your own family. I've protected my family from a predator, I replied quietly. Sarah and Emma deserve better than living with someone who would exploit elderly people for money. After they left, Sarah collapsed into a chair, her world clearly shattered by what she'd just learned. Mom, I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I had no idea. I thought we were helping you. I thought Mark was just concerned about your safety. I sat beside her and took her hand, feeling the weight of the months of deception and manipulation lifting from my shoulders. Sarah, honey, you're not responsible for Mark's choices. He's very good at manipulation, at making people see what he wants them to see. But I should have known. I should have listened to you more carefully, paid attention to what was really happening. Mark counted on your love for me to blind you to what he was doing. He used your genuine concern as a weapon against both of us. Emma appeared in the doorway, her young face serious as she took in the scene of her mother crying and her grandmother holding evidence folders. Grandma, is Daddy Mark going to jail? She asked with the directness that only children possess. I don't know, sweetheart, but he won't be able to hurt anyone anymore. Good, Emma said firmly. I didn't like how he talked about you when you weren't listening. Over the following hours, the full scope of Mark's deception became clear. Frank returned with a search warrant and seized Mark's computers, phones, and financial records. They found evidence of similar schemes involving other elderly people, a pattern of exploitation that had been going on for years. Patricia Collins was arrested as an accomplice. Her careful documentation of my supposed symptoms revealed to be part of a deliberate campaign to create evidence of incompetence. Richard Blackwood, the attorney, was under investigation for his role in facilitating elder fraud. The medications Mark had been giving me were analyzed and found to include drugs that weren't prescribed, substances that could indeed cause confusion, memory problems, and cognitive impairment. His plan had been to gradually increase these medications until my mental state deteriorated enough to justify emergency guardianship. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators examined Mark's financial records. He hadn't just been planning to steal my money. He'd already begun the process. Small amounts had been transferred from my accounts to his business ventures, justified as loans or investment opportunities that I supposedly had approved during periods when I was heavily sedated. The total amount stolen was over $60,000, money that would have been lost forever if I hadn't discovered his scheme when I did. Sarah was devastated by the betrayal, but also relieved to understand why her marriage had been feeling increasingly strained. Mark's financial desperation had been affecting every aspect of their family life, and his obsession with my assets had been consuming him. "I kept wondering why he was so interested in your finances," she told me as we sat in my old kitchen, having returned to my house for the first time in months. "He would ask questions about your investments, your property values, things that seemed intrusive, but I thought he was just trying to be helpful." "He was gathering intelligence," I replied. "Everything he did was calculated to support his ultimate goal of gaining control over my money." The house felt strange after months away, but also welcoming. It smelled like home, like the life Robert and I had built together. Being back in my own space, surrounded by my own belongings, made me realize how much of myself I'd lost during those months of captivity disguised as care. But I'd also gained something. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd believed, more resourceful than I'd given myself credit for. The woman who had felt helpless and dependent just months earlier had orchestrated the downfall of a sophisticated criminal operation. Frank stopped by that evening to update me on the investigation's progress. "Mark Thompson has a history we're just beginning to uncover," he told me. "This appears to be his method of operation. He targets recently widowed women, insinuates himself into their families through marriage or friendship, then systematically works to gain control of their assets." "How many others?" I asked. "We're not sure yet, but we've identified at least 3 other cases with similar patterns. You may have prevented him from victimizing additional people by coming forward when you did." The legal proceedings would take months to resolve, but the immediate threat was over. I was back in my own home, in control of my own life, free from the medications and manipulation that had clouded my thinking for so long. Sarah and Emma stayed with me for the first week, all of us adjusting to the new reality of life without Mark's manipulative presence. It was during that time that I realized how much damage his schemes had done to the family bonds that should have been sources of strength and support. "I don't know how to trust my own judgment anymore," Sarah confessed one evening. "If I could be so wrong about Mark, so blind to what he was doing, how can I trust myself to make good decisions about anything?" "Because Mark is a professional manipulator," I reminded her. "He's skilled at making people see what he wants them to see. The fact that you cared about me, that you wanted to help, those aren't weaknesses. He exploited your love, but that doesn't make your love wrong. I almost let him steal everything from you, but you didn't. When the truth came out, you believed me. You chose to see what was really happening instead of clinging to the comfortable lies he'd been telling. The road to rebuilding our relationship would be long, but we had time now. Time without the pressure of Mark's manipulation. Time to rediscover who we were as mother and daughter, without his toxic influence shaping every interaction. And I had proven something to myself that I'd begun to doubt. I was still the woman who had successfully navigated decades of life's challenges. I was still capable of protecting myself and the people I loved. I was still Diane Parker, and no, one could take that away from me. The attempted theft of my independence had failed, but it had also revealed reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. In trying to destroy me, Mark had actually helped me discover just how resilient I truly was. 6 months later, I stood in the witness box of the county courthouse, my hand resting on a Bible as I swore to tell the truth about everything that had happened. The courtroom was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Mark's crimes, other elderly victims who had found the courage to come forward after my case made headlines. Mark sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits and confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. He refused to meet my eyes as I began my testimony, describing in detail how he had systematically worked to undermine my independence and steal my life savings. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Andrea Chen, guided me through the timeline of Mark's deception. We went through each incident he had documented as evidence of my decline, explaining how normal human behaviors had been twisted into symptoms of incompetence. "Mrs. Parker," she asked, "when you discovered Mark's text messages about creating a medical emergency, what went through your mind?" "I realized that I wasn't just dealing with someone who was greedy," I replied, looking directly at the jury. "I was dealing with someone who was willing to harm me physically to get what he wanted. That's when I knew I had to act quickly, before he could escalate his plans." The defense attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed uncomfortable with his client's case, tried to paint me as a vindictive family member seeking revenge for legitimate care decisions, but the evidence was overwhelming, and my demeanor on the witness stand clearly demonstrated the mental competence that Mark had claimed I lacked. "Mrs. Parker," the defense attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you were struggling with grief and depression following your husband's death?" "Of course I was grieving," I replied. "I'd lost my husband of 47 years. But grief doesn't equal incompetence, and depression doesn't justify theft. But you did make mistakes with medications, missed appointments, had incidents that concerned your family?" I made the same kinds of minor mistakes that anyone might make during a difficult period. Mark chose to document and exaggerate those mistakes to support his narrative that I was declining mentally. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, medication tampering, and theft. Mark was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution, not just to me, but to the other victims whose cases had been uncovered during the investigation. Patricia Collins received 2 years for her role as an accomplice, while Richard Blackwood lost his license to practice law and faced separate criminal charges for his involvement in multiple elder fraud cases. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, couldn't undo all the damage that had been done. Sarah struggled with depression and guilt over her role in Mark's scheme, even though she had been as much a victim as anyone. She'd lost her home when the mortgage went into foreclosure, and she was raising Emma as a single mother while trying to rebuild her life. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," she told me one afternoon as we sat in my garden, watching Emma play among the roses Robert had planted. "The way Mark always steered conversations toward your finances, how he volunteered to handle things you were perfectly capable of managing yourself. Sarah, you trusted your husband. That's what wives are supposed to do. Mark exploited that trust, but it doesn't make you foolish for having it. I almost let him destroy you. But he didn't destroy me. And he didn't destroy us. We're still here, still family, still capable of moving forward together." The healing process was slow and sometimes painful. Emma, resilient in the way children often are, adjusted to her new life with remarkable grace. She spent most afternoons with me after school, helping in the garden and listening to stories about her grandfather Robert that I'd never had the courage to share during the dark months when Mark controlled our household. "Grandpa planted these roses for you?" she asked one day, carefully watering a bush that was just beginning to bloom. "For our 20th wedding anniversary. He said he wanted to give me something that would keep growing more beautiful every year." "Like your love?" "Exactly like our love." Emma's innocent wisdom often cut straight to the heart of things that adults complicated with guilt and regret. She understood that Mark had been a bad person who did bad things, but she didn't dwell on the might-have-beens or the what-ifs that tormented her mother. The ripple effects of Mark's exposure extended far beyond our family. The investigation had uncovered a network of lawyers, healthcare workers, and financial advisors who specialized in exploiting elderly people. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic abuse I had experienced, and training programs were developed to help families recognize the warning signs of elder fraud. I found myself becoming an advocate for other victims, speaking at conferences and workshops about the tactics predators use to gain control over vulnerable seniors. My story became a cautionary tale, but also a source of hope for people who felt trapped in similar situations. The most important thing to remember, I would tell audiences, is that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. We have wisdom, experience, and resources that younger people often underestimate. Trust your instincts, document everything, and never be afraid to ask for help when something feels wrong. Detective Frank Morrison and I developed a friendship that extended beyond the professional relationship that had saved my life. He often consulted with me on cases involving elderly victims, knowing that my experience gave me insights into the psychological tactics used by financial predators. "You know," he told me one day as we reviewed evidence in another case, "Mark thought he was targeting a helpless old woman. He had no idea he was dealing with someone who would outthink him at every turn." "I had advantages he didn't know about," I replied. 60 years of experience reading people, a lifetime of solving problems, and the motivation that comes from fighting for your own survival. The house that had once felt too large and empty gradually became home again. I made some changes, updates that reflected my life as an independent woman rather than half of a couple. I converted Robert's study into a bright sitting room where I could read and work on the memoir I was writing about my experience. The book, titled The Last Laugh: How I Outsmarted the Con Man Who Tried to Steal My Life, became a bestseller and led to speaking engagements across the country. I donated most of the proceeds to organizations that helped elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. But the most meaningful change in my life was the relationship I rebuilt with Sarah and Emma. Without Mark's toxic influence shaping every interaction, we rediscovered the bonds that had always existed beneath the manipulation and control. Sarah went back to school to become a social worker, inspired by our experience to help other families navigate the complex challenges of caring for aging relatives. She specialized in family counseling, with a particular focus on cases where financial abuse was suspected. "I want to help people recognize what we went through," she told me when she graduated with her master's degree. "I want to make sure other families don't fall victim to the kind of manipulation we experienced." Emma grew into a confident, intelligent young woman who understood that strength came in many forms. She wrote essays about her grandmother for school projects, describing how I had used intelligence and patience to defeat someone who thought he could exploit my age and vulnerability. "My grandma taught me that being smart is more important than being strong," she wrote in one assignment. "She showed me that you can fight back against bad people even when they think you're powerless." The legal settlements from Mark's conviction allowed me to establish a foundation dedicated to elder rights advocacy. The Diane Parker Foundation provided legal assistance to elderly people facing financial abuse, funded training programs for law enforcement officers, and supported research into the psychological tactics used by predators who target seniors. On the 5th anniversary of Mark's conviction, I held a ceremony in my garden to honor the other victims who had found the courage to come forward. Robert's roses were in full bloom, and the afternoon was filled with stories of survival and resilience from people who had refused to be defined by their victimization. Dr. James Morrison, Frank's father and my longtime attorney, spoke about the legal precedents that had been established through our case. New protections for elderly people were now in place, making it much harder for future predators to exploit the kind of systematic vulnerabilities that Mark had used against me. Diane Parker didn't just save herself, he told the gathered crowd. She changed the system that allowed her abuse to happen in the first place. As the sun set over the garden that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I thought about the woman I had been 5 years earlier, confused and frightened, allowing others to make decisions about her life because she had lost confidence in her own capabilities. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The experience of fighting for my independence had revealed reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, capabilities that had been dormant but never truly lost. I also thought about Robert, and how he would have reacted to everything that had happened. I could imagine his pride in my resilience, his amazement at the detective work I had conducted, his satisfaction in seeing justice served against someone who had tried to exploit his widow. "You would have been proud of me," I whispered to his photograph as I prepared for bed that night. I protected what we built together. I didn't let them take it away. The morning brought news that never failed to satisfy me. Another elderly person had used the resources provided by our foundation to escape a similar situation. This time, it was an 80-year-old man whose stepchildren had been slowly isolating him from friends and medical care while systematically draining his bank accounts. With the help of our legal team and the protocols we had developed, he had been able to document the abuse and pursue criminal charges before losing everything. His case would be resolved in months rather than years, and he would retain control over his own life and finances. These victories, large and small, gave meaning to everything I had endured. Every person who avoided becoming a victim, every family that recognized the warning signs before it was too late, every predator who was caught and prosecuted, they all represented proof that the darkness I had experienced had ultimately led to light for others. I continued living in my own home, managing my own affairs, making my own decisions about how to spend my time and resources. I had help when I needed it. A housekeeper who came twice a week, a gardener who maintained the heavier landscaping, work, a driver for longer trips when I preferred not to navigate highway traffic. But these were choices I made freely, services I hired on my own terms, not restrictions imposed by people who claimed to know what was best for me. The difference was profound, representing the essence of what I had fought to preserve: the right to determine my own life. On quiet evenings, I often sat in the garden with a cup of tea, surrounded by the roses that Robert had planted and the life we had built together. I was 78 years old now, with silver hair and laugh lines that mapped the geography of a full life. I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, in control of my own destiny, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I owned. Mark Thompson had tried to steal my independence, my dignity, and my life savings. Instead, he had given me something far more valuable: the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The last laugh, as it turned out, was mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.